If you're struggling to deploy your Umbraco website into production, this is a must-watch video for you. In this video, I'm going to take my website that I've just upgraded to Umbraco 12.13, and then we're going to deploy it into production. So I'm going to walk you through all the steps, the process, and as you'd expect, I do encounter issues, so I'll walk you through how I fix them. Now, a bunch of people have asked me to create this video for a while now, so I hope a lot of people get value. With that said and done, because we've got so much to cover, let's get on and deploy these files. Right, so before we start thinking about deployments, upgrades, any of that malarkey, the first thing we always need to do is back everything up. So I'm in my web host. You can see here that we've got my SQL database, and then all I've got to do is click the backup button, store it offline, and jobs are good 'un. So this is another upgrade thing. However, the second thing you should consider is backing up your files from production. Now, I'm on my website here, and the two main files that I recommend you back up are first the media folder. So you can find the media folder in www roots. If you expand this open, you can see media here, and then if I click on this, you can see there's a bunch of files and folders. Now, this basically covers all the images, all the files that have been uploaded by content editors into the CMS, so make sure you back this up. Now, the second one, which is really important if things go wrong, is to make sure that you back up all your configuration. So you can see here that I've got my app settings, my web.config, my runtime.json. Always make sure that you copy these locally before you start anything, because if your website goes down or you've got missing settings, being able to refer to these files are going to be really, really handy later on. Now, another really important thing, however, I'm not going to cover it in too much detail in this video, is making sure that you have the right app settings and the right environments for your application. So you can see here I've got one for debug, I've got one for production, and in order to make sure that these settings load, in my program.cs, you can see I've got this bit of code here. So it says add a JSON file app settings.json, and then if we're in the right environment, we're going to overwrite and update our app settings with our production version. Now, because we've got so much to cover in this video, I'm not going to give you a deep dive walkthrough on how to set up your application settings for different environments in this video. Now, if you're interested in learning more about that process, I have recorded a video all about that topic. So the link to the video is in the related tutorial below. Click on that and have a look at it if you want to learn more. Otherwise, let's move on. Now, when it comes to deployment, we'll need to copy our code locally and push it onto production. And in order to do this, we need to create a publish profile. We're now inside Visual Studio and I've loaded my website. Now, if I click on my website, you can see that we've got publish here. We can also access it from the menu down here. And clicking on that profile button is going to launch this wizard. Now, if you're deploying your site for the first time, you're going to have to create yourself a brand new profile. And you can do that by clicking on this button. Now, this is going to launch the publish type wizard. And from here, we can deploy to either Azure, Docker. We've got the option to push to a folder locally. We can deploy automatically using FTP. We've also got the option to do a web server deploy, or we can import an existing profile. Now, the way that I deploy my website is to deploy the files locally and then use FTP to manually copy them over to my web host. And that's the reason why I'm selecting folder here. Now, once you've done that, click next, and this is going to allow you to pick where on your file system you want to deploy your files to. So in my instance, I'm going to go on my C drive, and then in my C drive, I'm going to deploy it to this websites folder right here. Now, when I've done that, I click finish. Doing this will create a brand new profile, which I can then alter the settings. Now that we've got our profile, we can start updating it. And we do that by clicking on these little edit buttons. So the first thing that I always do is make sure this delete existing files is set to true. So click on the little edit button in this drop down, which is called file publish options. Enable this, and we can see we've got delete all existing files prior to publish. So this basically means that when you do a publish in your target folder, all the files will be deleted each time you publish into it. And this is much safer than trying to merge into existing files. Now, the next setting we should look at is configuration. And for probably 95% of the people, this is going to typically be release. Now, unless you've created your own different environments, just stick with release. Next up, we've got Target Framework. So Target Framework, if you're using Umbraco 12, it should be .NET 7. If you're using Umbraco 13, it should be .NET 8. Next up, we have Deployment Mode. So for the deployment mode, we have two different settings. We have framework dependent and self-contained. Now, I typically use this framework dependent mode. And this basically means that when you're doing a deployment and a publish, during that publish process, the .NET Framework is going to include all the runtimes required to run your application on any single environment. So I've quickly jumped into my website's publish directory just so you can see what the output of this framework dependent mode looks like. So you can see straight away we've got a bunch of folders, and each folder represents an operating system and a processor type. Now if I look in the Windows one, you'll see that in each folder we've got a bunch of different files. And all these files will basically allow any environment to run our application. Now obviously the downside of this is that when you're doing a deployment, you're going to also have to copy all of these files. And this basically means that you're going to be transferring more data, and it's going to take you more time. So straight away you can see that this output folder here is 200 megabytes. So by enabling that mode, we're copying an extra 200 meg of stuff each time we deploy to production. So obviously having to deal with an extra 200 megabytes of files on each deployment is not ideal, but the trade-off of dealing with it is simplicity. Now when we've got framework dependent mode set here, I can just use this portable target runtime, meaning I don't care what the end server's target runtime is. Now when I'm using self-contained, I'm just publishing the files that I'm interested in, then I have to actually know what the end server is running with. So you can see in my target runtime, I no longer have portable. I need to say, is it Windows, is it Linux, is it 64-bit, is it not? Most of the time on shared hosting, I have no idea, I don't care. And this is one of the trade-offs you're going to have to make between the framework dependent, which is easy, and self-contained, which is less files, but you have to know more information about your end environment. Now, in case you didn't know, when you create these publish profiles, they basically get stored as XML files within properties, publish profiles. So if I click on this XML file here, you can see that we've got all the different settings here. And if you want to update these settings just in XML, you can do by updating this folder. Now that we have our publish profile set up, let's assume that it went through okay and we've got some files, and we now want to copy those files over to production. Now for my own personal website, I host everything in classic web hosting, and I use FTP to copy the files over. So that's what we're going to do in this video. Now I've done Azure, Umbraco Cloud over the years. However, for my personal website, I find classic web hosting the cheapest, and I use FTP because I'm the only person who works on it and I know what I'm doing. Now, just in terms of FTP clients, my preference is to use FileZilla. Now, the reason for this is one, it's free, and the second benefit is because it allows you to store your connections. So let's say I click on this little button right here, you can see that I can add in a new site really easily. Now, when I add in a new site, I give it a host, I can give it a username and password, and once it's stored, I don't need to remember my details anymore. And this saves me a bunch of time because it just means whenever I need to copy files, I come into FileZilla, click this button, and then within seconds, I can transfer files locally onto my remote server. Well, that covered the basics and the theory around publishing. And in a minute, I'm going to actually walk you through a real life example of me upgrading my website, the issues that I encounter and how I fix them. However, before we get there, there's an invaluable thing that we should probably go over. And that is reviewing the live files and folders on my production website and go over what they do. Now, typically when I've had issues with deployments, it's because there's been missing files, wrong settings, things are being locked. So hopefully going through my file system will allow you to check when you do a publish, all the files and folders exist that should do. So the first folder we have up here is app_plugins, and in here we're going to have plugin related code. You can see here we've got OpenStreetMap, which is used by a property in the back end. So if you're installing additional plugins, make sure that anything which gets created locally gets copied here, otherwise your back end will probably break. Next, you can see we've got loads of locale named folders. And if I click in all of these, you can see we've just got this Microsoft code analysis. Typically, unless you're doing something funky, you can ignore these. Now, the next folder in our list is the log folder. However, this log folder is the system log folder. Now, when it comes to your application, you're going to have your HTTP, your web server, your Umbraco logs, and we'll get to that log folder later. However, this log folder in my root is something that I've explicitly enabled, and this is for the system logs. And this is really useful when you're trying to do upgrades or install a brand new version of Umbraco, because it's going to tell you what's going wrong when your application is trying to boot up. Now, these system logs are going to live in this folder here called logs. If you click on it, you can see that it's got this SDA out and there's a bunch of stuff in here. Now, in order to explicitly turn on these logs, if I go to my web.config, and yes, we still need a web.config, if I click on it, you'll see that I've got this line here. So in my ASP.NET Core, you can see it's registering my website assembly. And then afterwards, you can see that we've got this SDA out log enabled. So at the moment, I've got mine turned off because I'm just running in production. And then you can see we've got this SD out log file. And in here, it's .logs and it's /std out. So when you come to deploy your website for the first time, I recommend that you enable these logs because it's going to make your life much easier when it comes to debugging issues. So after this logs folder, the next folder of interest is this refs folder right here. And this is a system folder. Now, because we're using the Razor View engine, basically what happens is that views are compiled on the fly when the application starts. So at runtime, in order to make sure that the View engine is using the same set of assemblies as compile time, the refs folder is generated during publish and it contains all the reference assemblies so your app works with the correct dependencies and things don't go funky. After refs, the next folder of interest is the runtime folder. Now, we've already covered the runtime folder, so depending on which mode you set it, this is either going to have a bunch of stuff in it or it isn't. Now, next up, we have another important folder, and this is the Umbraco folder. So if we expand this, you can see that in here, we actually have our Umbraco logs. So this is definitely a key one, because when it comes to debugging while your pages aren't loading, pretty much most of the time, the answer is going to be within these logs right here. Now, aside from this, we've got the data folder. You can see in the data folder, we've got things like new cache. We've got things like our examine indexes, which is used for the searches. We've also got things like some views. So for the Umbraco back office views, we've got some installation views, all that kind of good stuff. Now, an important thing to note about that data file is that unless you're using SQLite, the chances are that most things in there are just going to be cache and temporary. So most of the time you can just delete that folder, no worries. However, it's a good place to check if you're having issues, because if things aren't getting generated in that folder, like the examine caches, it's likely that you've got some sort of permission error somewhere. Next, we have the view folder. This is where your template's going to live, classic.NET stuff. Whenever I'm deploying, always make sure that these CS/HTML files get copied across as well. So over the years, there's been countless times when I've had missing files through that publish process. Now, just in case you weren't aware, if you're ever missing a file, in Solution Explorer, if you just right click on it, do properties, then within the properties tab here, you see you've got a build option, so we can say content. Also, if you want to be more explicit, you can also say copy to output. And if you just make sure that this is copy always, this is going to ensure that your views and your files get copied across. Now, next up, we have our www root, and this is key because whenever you go to johndjones.com/, anything in this folder will appear. So we can see that I've got my CSS files here. So if I click on this, here's all my style sheets. I've got all the fonts that my site uses. Now, more importantly, I've got the media folder here. Now, this media folder is a key folder to consider in your deployment process. And the reason for this, as you can see from this blog post I've written about it, is that when you upload anything in the editor, so images, files, videos, whatever it might be, it's going to get uploaded into the file system and it's going to live in the media folder. So this means that when your website's running, while people use Umbraco, the content of that media folder is not going to be in source control. So this means that when you're initially setting up your website, you're going to need to think of a strategy to make sure that that media file is backed up. Now, me personally, for this website, all I do is I FTP in twice a month, make a copy of my media file locally, commit it to source code, and off I go. And that's not ideal. I wouldn't do it on a production client website, but for my own stuff, it's okay. Now, other options are you might want to store it in an S3 bucket or Azure storage, and they are providers that will allow you to do that. Obviously, you might be able to rely on your web hosting backup mechanism if you want to. However, it is a great idea to consider how you want to back up that media file, because if all your files get corrupted on your web host, you are going to lose loads of content that's been added by content editors, and you won't want that. Now, the next two folders within my www root are custom folders that I use myself, so plugins and scripts. These relate to stuff that my website uses. And then the final folder in here is the Umbraco folder. Now, the Umbraco folder is where all the assets live that Umbraco requires for the CMS to work. So you can see here that we've got things like assets, we've got JS, we've got the libs, we've got views. So this folder is basically where Umbraco lives. And this is the reason that when you do, say, your website.com/Umbraco, this is the map that it's going to. And as well as some folders, we also have a few files in www root, and these are where you're going to put your normal website files. So you can see here I've got my 500 page. The thing I've grayed out is my Google Analytics authentication file. You can see I've got my robots.txt, my fav icon, my Google AdWords authentication file, all of it. Now, obviously, www root is mainly going to be comprised of your web files, CSS files, all that kind of stuff, but you've seen all the Umbraco related stuff that you should expect to find in there. So that covered all the folders. Let's look at the files next. So because we're using .NET Core, .NET 8, you can see that I've got an app settings.json. You also need to make sure you have your app settings-schema.json to make sure things are right. Now, in your root, you're going to have a bunch of assemblies, and you should also have your application assembly. So my application is called John D. Jones. So you can see how I've got John D. Jones-exe. You can also see I've got this deps.json. Now, one thing that you really don't want to have in your web root is these PDB files. Now, these are debugging files, and the reason why I've got these is because I was a Wally at one stage. I deployed everything in debug mode, and I haven't been bothered to tidy it up. So you shouldn't have these files, and if you do, make sure you clean them up. Now, the main stuff in here are mainly assemblies. However, down the bottom, we also need to make sure we have our web.config. So our web.config we covered earlier, and that's how we can do our logging. However, there's a few other things on here which basically configure how the web hosting works. And then we've also got this runtime.json. So just in terms of files, these are the key things you need to make sure exist. So the first thing I do before copying the files across to make sure that nothing gets locked is to turn the site off. So for me, I just need to log into my web host, go to site turn on off, click this little button. Now we're ready to deploy our code. Now that we have our files unlocked, we're ready to copy things over. So in the left hand panel here, you can see I've got my publish folder locally, and in the right hand panel here, this is my live production website. So all I need to do is copy files over. Now, one of the benefits of FTP is you can be selective on what files that you copy over. Now, typically, most of my releases, they're only small code tweaks, and this is why I'll typically only copy, say, like a single assembly across. Now, for this upgrade, what I'm going to attempt first is to only copy over the assemblies and my folders. So what I'm going to do is delete my config files. I can always regenerate them later, and then I'm going to try and copy all of this over directly. So we've skipped about 6 minutes into the future. My files have deployed. I've gone back into my web host. I've turned on my site. I've tried to load my homepage, and now we're currently waiting for it to load. So, as expected, I've got some sort of a bad gateway 502 error. So now I need to look at it. Now, the first thing I want to do is go straight back over to my web root files. And then if I go all the way down here to my web config, what I want to do is now enable my logs. So if I just click on this, go to view edits, you can see here that I've got my standard log enabled equals true. Now this means that when we go back into my log files here, now when it comes to your own deployments, if you look in this folder and you can see that logs are being generated, that basically means that something's gone wrong. So this is the log file that you need to look at. Now luckily FileZilla allows me to view the log remotely. So if I open it up, what we will see is an error straight away. So this means that something's gone wrong. So this error reads, hopefully you can see it, invalid operation exception, unable to resolve service for type Microsoft, ASP.NET Core, data protection, infrastructure, application discriminator while trying to activate Umbraco CMS Web Common Logging Enrichers Application ID Enricher. So after getting this error, the first thing I did was turn to Google and I couldn't really find anything useful. So this is the reason why the next step, I opened up my site locally, I made sure that I could debug it and it loaded. Now the site looks a bit funky here, however I knew the site worked, so the chances are that the issue was with the deployment itself. Now one of the big issues with FTP is that it doesn't have any notion of transaction. So I've got my main website DLL, I'm copying it over to my production site, it's now running and you can see that the process can't be copied because it's locked and it's been used by another process. Now when you're copying 6,000 files, it's very likely that a few of them might fail using FTP. And this is basically what happened to me. Now because I was copying files on top of other files, I had no idea which files copied correctly or not. So it took me about 20 minutes for head scratching. However, eventually what I did is I went into production, I literally deleted everything. The only thing that I didn't delete in the end was the Umbraco media folder. So in here we've got www root media folder. Now this thing's gigantic, it's got a bunch of stuff in here, so I left this alone, but I deleted everything else and then I copied everything else over again. So we're in the future again, I've now got all my files, they've been transferred over, I've gone back into a browser and I've tried to view my site. Now if things go okay, as you can see on screen, kick-ass, I've got my website maintenance page. Now the reason why I'm seeing this is because I still need to upgrade my database before my website will work. So in order to do this, I need to go to /Umbraco, then I need to log in using my details, and then after this, it's going to launch the upgrade wizard, and then after the upgrade wizard launches, my Umbraco backend should launch, and my site should be fully updated, and it should be working as expected. So as you can see on screen, sadly halfway through the upgrade wizard process, the installer failed. Now the issue was that the new cache file was locked. Now I have to admit, since moving from Framework to .NET Core 7 and 8, I encounter locking issues all the time. And typically when I get these locking issues, I go into my web host, I refresh or recycle my app pool and things become unlocked and I can carry on again. And that's exactly what I did in this instance, and this unlocked the issue. When I reran the wizard after refreshing the app pool, everything went through okay, and as you can see on screen, the editor loaded, my site upgraded, and everything was working as expected. So that covers FTP, and I know it's a bit janky, it's probably not what I'd do if I was working in a team, however I'm hoping that's been valuable for a few people. Now you might be there thinking, how do I do this in Azure or direct FTP or maybe even a web transfer? And if I'm honest, as long as you understand those steps, from my experience, it's pretty much the same. So just to reiterate, it's getting everything working locally, that's key, then understanding the files that you want to copy, and then understanding how to debug issues in production when they occur, because they always occur. And following these all together, you're pretty much going to be okay. And when things do go wrong, it's typically because files don't copy properly or you've got some sort of setting which is wrong, and that's the reason why you have those backup config files, and also using something like a WinMerge or a file diff tool to compare the different versions to get things up and running again. So this is a video that I've been asked for a few times over the years, and I've always been a bit hesitant because I'm not sure if people will get the value from it. So let me know in the comments below if this was useful, or if you want to see me do other deployment type videos, could be Umbraco or maybe just .NET. Now we've got to the stage of the video where if you haven't hit subscribe now, we've got to the stage of the video where if you haven't hit subscribe Now we've got to that stage of the video where if you haven't hit subscribe by now, what is wrong with you? So take time out, hit subscribe, because I'll teach you more about Umbraco in the future. Trust me. Also, if you have got value and this has saved you some time debugging, hit that like button because I would appreciate it. Now, if you do want to learn more about Umbraco and deployments, then I've actually created a video on Umbraco and Docker. And there's a bunch of stuff there which will help you out with deployments as well. So the link to that video is on screen right now. Click on that. Otherwise, I hope you're having a great day. And until next Sunday, happy coding.